The Canadian Army is one of three environmental commands within the Unified Canadian Armed Forces. As of September 2013, the Army has 21,600 regular soldiers, about 24,000 reserve soldiers, and 5,000 rangers, for a total of 50,600 soldiers. The Army is supported by 5,600 civilian employees. It maintains regular forces units at bases across Canada, and is also responsible for the Army Reserve, the largest component of the primary reserve. The commander of the Canadian Army and Chief of the Army Staff is Lieutenant General Paul Winnick. The name Canadian Army only came into official use beginning in 1940. From before Confederation until the Second World War, the official designation was Canadian Militia. On the 1st of April 1966, as a precursor to the unification of Canada's armed services, all land forces were placed under a new entity called Mobile Command. In 1968, the Canadian Army ceased to exist as a legal entity as the Royal Canadian Navy, Canadian Army, and Royal Canadian Air Force were merged to form a single service called the Canadian Armed Forces. Mobile Command was renamed Land Force Command in the 1993 reorganization of the Canadian Armed Forces. In August 2011, Land Force Command reverted to the pre-1968 title of the Canadian Army. History. Prior to Confederation in 1867, the British Army, which included both defensible regiments of the British Army, recruited within British North America exclusively for service in North America, in Canadian militia units, was responsible for the defense of Canada. Some current regiments of the Canadian Army trace their origins to these pre-Confederation militia and fencible units. After 1867, a permanent active militia was formed, and in later decades several regular bodies of troops were created, their descendants becoming the Royal Canadian Horse Artillery, the Royal Canadian Dragoons, and the Royal Canadian Regiment. Regular Canadian troops participated in the Northwest Rebellion in 1885, the South African War in 1899, and, in much larger numbers, constituted the Canadian Expeditionary Force in First World War. In 1940, during Second World War, the permanent active militia was renamed the Canadian Army, supplemented by the non-permanent militia, which was named the Canadian Army. The Army participated in the Korean War and formed part of the NATO presence in West Germany during the Cold War. In the years following its unification with the Navy and Air Force in 1968, the size of Canada's land forces was reduced, but Canadian troops participated in a number of military actions with Canada's allies, including the Gulf War in 1991 and the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, as well as peacekeeping operations under United Nations auspices in various parts of the world. Despite Canada's usual support of British and American initiatives, Canada's land forces did not directly participate in the Vietnam War or the Iraq War. Structure. Command of the Army is exercised by National Defence Headquarters in Ottawa. The Army is divided into 4 divisions: 2nd Canadian Division, 3rd Canadian Division, 4th Canadian Division, 5th Canadian Division, 1st Canadian Division, now under Canadian Joint Operations Command and no longer part of the Canadian Army, serves as a deployable headquarters in the event of a major mobilization of Canadian forces on operations, and has taken the place of the previous Canadian Joint Forces HQ. The other 4 divisions replace the previous geographical land force areas, and are responsible for administering all regular and reserve force units within them. The 2nd, 3rd and 4th Canadian Divisions each have a regular Army mechanized brigade group under their command. together with between 2 and 3 reserve brigades. Each mechanized brigade group contains 3 infantry battalions, an armored regiment, an artillery regiment, and a combat engineer regiment. Each brigade group also contains a service support battalion and a signals squadron. In addition to the 4 regional command areas, the Canadian Army Doctrine and Training Centre, previously called Land Force Doctrine and Training System, commanded by a Major General and headquartered at McNaughton Barracks, CFB Kingston, Ontario, is responsible for the supervision, integration and delivery of Army training and doctrine development, including simulation and digitization. It includes a number of schools and training organizations, such as the Combat Training Centre at CFB Gagetown, New Brunswick, and the Canadian Maneuver Training Centre at CFB Wainwright, Alberta. Leadership. The senior appointment within the Canadian Army was Chief of the General Staff until 1964, when the appointment became Commander, Mobile Command in advance of the unification of Canada's military forces. The position was renamed Chief of the Land Staff in 1993. Following the reversion of land forces to the Canadian Army in 2011, the position became Commander of the Canadian Army and Chief of the Army Staff. Officers are selected in several ways. The regular officer training plan, where candidates are educated at the Royal Military College of Canada or at civilian Canadian universities. Direct entry officer plan, for those who already hold a university degree or technology diploma. Continuing education officer training plan, addresses shortages in certain officer occupations, and is intended to attract candidates who are otherwise qualified for service as officers, but who lack a degree. Candidates complete their degrees while serving in the Army. University training plan, designed to develop selected serving non-commissioned members for service as career officers in the regular force. Normally, candidates selected for this plan will attend RMC or a civilian university in Canada. Commissioning from the ranks plan provides officers to augment the number of officers commissioned through other plans and applies exclusively to those who have acquired some military experience and possess the necessary qualities that make them suitable for employment as officers. Special Requirements Commissioning Plan is designed to meet the needs of the officer occupations. It allows the Canadian Forces to profit from the skills and experience of senior non-commissioned members and may provide an opportunity for career advancement for selected deserving chief warrant officers. Subsidized special education, which includes the Medical Officer Training Plan and Dental Officer Training Plan. In addition, there were other commissioning plans such as the Officer Candidate Training Plan and Officer Candidate Training Plan for commissioning serving members, which are no longer in effect. Occupational training for Canadian Army officers takes place at one of the schools of the Combat Training Centre for Army-controlled occupations or at a Canadian Armed Forces school, such as the Canadian Forces School of Administration and Logistics or the Defence Public Affairs Learning Centre for officers from career fields controlled outside the Army. Regular force Canadian infantry and armoured regimental traditions are strongly rooted in the traditions and history of the British Army. Many regiments were patterned after regiments of the British Army, and a system of official alliances or affiliations was created to perpetuate a sense of shared history. Other regiments developed independently, resulting in a mixture of both colourful and historically familiar names. Other traditions such as battle honours and colours have been maintained by Canadian regiments as well. Approximately two-thirds of the regular force is composed of Anglophone units, while one-third is Francophone. Between 1953 and 1971, the regular Canadian infantry consisted of 7 regiments, each of 2 battalions. The 3 present regular infantry regiments were augmented by 3 further regiments, each of 2 battalions, the Canadian Guards, the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, the Black Watch of Canada. Following their unification of the three services to form the Canadian Armed Forces in 1968, the regular force battalions of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada and the Black Watch were dissolved. The regular regiment of the Fort Garry Horse was disbanded and the Canadian Guards were reduced to nil strength. The 1st Battalion of the Canadian Guards was disbanded on 1 October 1968. On 6 July 1970, the 2nd Battalion, the Canadian Guards, was reduced to nil strength and transferred to the Supplementary Order of Battle, with the unit's soldiers and officers becoming the 3rd Battalion, the Royal Canadian Regiment. On 1 July 1970, the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the Black Watch of Canada were reduced to nil strength and transferred to the Supplementary Order of Battle, and the Reserve Force Battalion automatically relinquished its numerical designation. On 15 September 1968, the 2nd Battalion, the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, was reduced to nil strength and transferred to the Supplementary Order of Battle, while when the 1st Battalion was reduced to nil strength and transferred to the Supplementary Order of Battle on 27 April 1970, with the unit's officers and soldiers forming the 3rd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. The Reserve Force Battalion automatically relinquished its numerical designation at that time. The Canadian Airborne Regiment was disbanded in 1995. The Regular Force Regiment of the 8th Canadian Hussars, formed in 1957, was converted to a mixed regular and reserve total force unit with the close out of 4 Canadian Mechanized Brigade Group at La Germany in 1994, before reverting to a reserve regiment in 1997. Army Reserve. The Army Reserve is the reserve element of the Canadian Army and the largest component of the primary reserve. The Army Reserve is organized into under-strength brigades along geographic lines. The Army Reserve is very active and has participated heavily in all regular Army deployments in the last decade, in some cases contributing as much as 40% of each deployment in either individual augmentation, as well as occasional formed subunits. LFR regiments have the theoretical administrative capacity to support an entire battalion, but typically have the deployable manpower of only 1 or 2 platoons. They are perpetuated as such for the timely absorption of recruits during times of war. Current strength of the Army Reserve is approximately 18,000. On April 1, 2008, the Army Reserve absorbed all units of the former Communications Reserve Organization of the Army. Canadian Army Headquarters, Canadian Army Doctrine and Training System, 2nd Canadian Division, 2nd Canadian Division HQ, 2nd Canadian Division Support Group, 2nd Canadian Division Training Centre, 5 Canadian Mechanized Brigade Group, 5 Canadian Mechanized Brigade Group HQ and Signals Squadron, 5E Regiment d'Artillerie Léger du Canada, 12E Regiment Blindé du Canada, 1E Bataillon, Royal 22E Regiment, 2E Bataillon, Royal 22E Regiment, 3E Bataillon, Royal 22E Regiment, 5 Combat Engineer Regiment, 5 Service Battalion, 34 Canadian Brigade Group, 34 Canadian Brigade Group Headquarters, the Royal Canadian Hussars Le Regiment de Hull, 4E Bataillon, Royal 22E Regiment, 6E Bataillon, Royal 22E Regiment, Le Regiment des Myres and Uves, Les Fusiliers Mont Royal, the Black Watch of Canada, the Canadian Grenadier Guards, the Royal Montreal Regiment, 2nd Field Artillery Regiment, RCA, 34th Signals Regiment, Signals, 34 Combat Engineer Regiment, 34 Service Battalion, 35 Canadian Brigade Group, 35 Canadian Brigade Group Headquarters, Sherbrooke Hussars, 12E Regiment Blindé du Canada, Le Regiment de la Chaudière, Le Regiment du Saguenay, Les Fusiliers de Sherbrooke, Les Fusiliers du Saint-Laurent, Les Voltigeurs de Quebec, 6th Field Artillery Regiment, RCA 62nd Field Artillery Regiment, RCA 35 Combat Engineer Regiment, 35 Service Battalion, 71 Communications Group, 712 Communication Squadron, Montreal, 713 Communication Regiment, Beauport, 714 Communications Squadron, Sherbrooke, 2 Canadian Ranger Patrol Group, Richelane, 3rd Canadian Division, 3rd Canadian Division HQ, 3rd Canadian Division Support Group, 3rd Canadian Division Training Centre, 1 Canadian Mechanized Brigade Group, 1 Canadian Mechanized Brigade Group and Signal Squadron, 1st Regiment, a Royal Canadian Horse Artillery, Lord Strathcona's Horse 1st Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, 3rd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, 1 Combat Engineer Regiment, 1 Service Battalion, 38 Canadian Brigade Group, 38 Canadian Brigade Group Headquarters, the Saskatchewan Dragoons, the Fort Garry Horse, the Royal Regina Rifles, the North Saskatchewan Regiment, the Royal Winnipeg Rifles, the Lake Superior Scottish Regiment, the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders of Canada, 10th Field Artillery Regiment, RCA 26th Field Artillery Regiment, RCA 116th Independent Field Battery, 38 Combat Engineer Regiment, 38th Signal Regiment, 38th Service Battalion, 39 Canadian Brigade Group, 39 Canadian Brigade Group Headquarters, the British Columbia Regiment, the British Columbia Dragoons, the Rocky Mountain Rangers, the Royal Westminster Regiment, the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, the Canadian Scottish Regiment, 5th Field Regiment, RCA 15th Field Regiment, RCA 39 Combat Engineer Regiment, 39 Signal Regiment, 39 Service Battalion, 39 Service Battalion, 41 Canadian Brigade Group, 41 Canadian Brigade Group Headquarters, the South Alberta Light Horse, the King's Own Calgary Regiment, the Loyal Edmonton Regiment, the Calgary Highlanders, 20th Field Regiment, Royal Canadian Artillery, 20th Independent Field Battery, RCA 41 Combat Engineer Regiment, 41 Signal Regiment, 41 Service Battalion, 4 Canadian Ranger Patrol Group, 4th Canadian Division, 4th Canadian Division HQ, 4th Canadian Division Support Group, 4th Canadian Division Training Centre, 2 Canadian Mechanized Brigade Group, 2 Canadian Mechanized Brigade Group HQ and Signal Squadron, 2nd Regiment, Royal Canadian Horse Artillery, Royal Canadian Dragoons, 1st Battalion, the Royal Canadian Regiment, 2nd Battalion, the Royal Canadian Regiment, 3rd Battalion, the Royal Canadian Regiment, 2 Combat Engineer Regiment, 2 Service Battalion, 31 Canadian Brigade Group, 31 Canadian Brigade Group Headquarters, 1st Hussars, the Windsor Regiment, the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, the Lincoln and Welland Regiment, 4th Battalion, the Royal Canadian Regiment, the Royal Highland Fusiliers of Canada, the Essex and Kent Scottish, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders of Canada, 11th Field Artillery Regiment, RCA 56th Field Artillery Regiment, RCA 31 Combat Engineer Regiment, 31 Service Battalion, 32 Canadian Brigade Group, 32 Canadian Brigade Group Headquarters, the Governor-General's Horse Guards, the Queen's York Rangers, the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, Ontario, the Royal Regiment of Canada, the Grey and Simcoe Foresters, the Lorne Scots, 48th Highlanders of Canada, the Toronto Scottish Regiment, 7th Toronto Regiment, RCA 32 Combat Engineer Regiment, 32 Service Battalion, 33 Canadian Brigade Group, 33 Canadian Brigade Group Headquarters, the Ontario Regiment, Governor-General's Foot Guards, the Princess of Wales's Own Regiment, the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment, the Brockville Rifles, Stormont, Dundas and Glengarry Highlanders, the Cameron Highlanders of Ottawa, the Algonquin Regiment, 2nd Battalion, Irish Regiment of Canada, 30th Field Artillery Regiment, RCA 49th Field Artillery Regiment, RCA 42nd Field Artillery Regiment, RCA 33 Combat Engineer Regiment, 33 Service Battalion 2 Operational Support Group 700 Communication Squadron 705 Communication Squadron 709 Communication Regiment, 763 Communication Regiment 772 Electronic Warfare Squadron 3 Canadian Ranger Patrol Group 2 Military Police Regiment Ceremonial Guard 2 Intelligence Company 5th Canadian Division 5th Canadian Division HQ 5th Canadian Division Support Group 5th Canadian Division Training Centre 4 Engineer Support Regiment 4th Regiment Royal Canadian Artillery 36 Canadian Brigade Group 36 Canadian Brigade Group Headquarters 36 Canadian Brigade Group Band the Halifax Rifles the Prince Edward Island Regiment 1st Field Artillery Regiment RCA 84th Independent Field Battery, RCA 45 Engineer Squadron the Princess Louise Fusiliers the West Nova Scotia Regiment the Nova Scotia Highlanders, the Cape Breton Highlanders 36 Service Battalion 36 Signals Regiment 37 Canadian Brigade Group 37 Canadian Brigade Group Headquarters, 8th Canadian Hussars 3rd Field Artillery Regiment, RCA 56 Engineer Squadron 1 Engineer Squadron 1st Battalion, the Royal New Brunswick Regiment, the North Shore Regiment 1st Battalion, a Royal Newfoundland Regiment 2nd Battalion, Royal Newfoundland Regiment 37 Service Battalion, 37th Signal Regiment 2 Squadron 724 Communication Squadron 37 Signal Regiment 8 Squadron 5 Canadian Ranger Patrol Group 3 Military Police Regiment Lower Sackville, Nova Scotia. Bases and training centres. 2nd Canadian Division 2nd Canadian Division Support Base Montreal Garrison Valcartier Garrison St. John. 2nd Canadian Division Training Centre Valcartier. 3rd Canadian Division 3rd Canadian Division Support Base Edmonton Garrison Wainwright, Garrison Shiloh 3rd Canadian Division Training Centre Wainwright 3rd Canadian Division Training Centre Detachment Shiloh, 4th Canadian Division 4th Canadian Division Support Base Petawawa Canadian Forces Base Kingston 4th Canadian Division Training Centre Meaford, 5th Canadian Division 5th Canadian Division Support Base Gagetown 5th Canadian Division Training Centre Gagetown.